What's up, guys? Live from Revival Church. Kind of a flickering. I don't know if you see the flicker. I feel like it's coming from these fluorescent lights. So today, we're going to be moving verses 10 through 35. And I mentioned yesterday, we're going to start doing a little bit of skimming. Not skimming because it's not important or, that we don't need this stuff. But if you look at, for instance, Exodus 25, we're in Exodus 35. But in Exodus 25, it has all the components of the tabernacle. Exodus 26 has components of the tabernacle. And I think if you even move a little bit more forward, we didn't very long ago talk about the artisans and the guys. Yeah, verse chapter 31, the artisans. So this is all now repeating stuff we've talked about. And so what I want to do is verses 10 to 35, I want to hit the highlights. So we're hitting repeats, but we're going to hit some highlights, and we're going to focus on one new thing. And so you'll notice starting in verse 10, right? Gather the artisans, and they're going to put together the tabernacle, tent, covering, clasp, boards, bars, pillars, sockets. It just goes on, and it names all those components we've talked about in the past. Highlight, though, again, that we talked about yesterday, that was back in verse 5. If you look at verse 21, it says, Then everyone came whose heart was stirred, and everyone whose spirit was willing. And they brought the Lord's offering for the work of the tabernacle. And I'm actually even just going to highlight those things in my Bible, because I like it, right? Who are they getting together to build the house of the Lord? It's those people whose hearts are stirred and whose spirit is willing. And that's what we want to see in our church and in your church, is that hearts are being stirred up and there's willing spirits who want to serve the Lord. In fact, it's just a natural byproduct of loving the Lord, is wanting to serve the Lord. Because you're excited about what God has done for you, and so you want to go and do things for Him. And so here's these people. Verse 22, it came both men and women, as many as had a willing heart. And so again, it's like we're seeing that there's this willingness, right? Now in verse 25, it talks about all the women who were gifted. And so now we see, of course, it's not just people who are willing, but people who are gifted. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no place because you don't have the gift of this and that or the other. But in short, that if you think God has called you to the worship team, if God has called you to the worship team, then God will have gifted you to be on the worship team. God gifts people for the callings that He's given them. And again, whose hearts were stirred in verse 26. In verse 29, it talks about whose hearts were willing, whose hearts were stirred, whose heart. You see the heart behind all of this stuff, right? And then what does God do? When we have a servant who wants to serve the Lord, first off, their heart's in the right place. Nextly, we see that they are gifted to do this task. It's obvious that they have the skills needed to do the task. God has gifted them. And then God goes beyond the gift. Verse 31, and He has filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom, understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. So now He's talking about Bezalel, the son of Uri, right, the son of Hur. Here's the leader. And He's poured out His Spirit on the leader. And this leader now is supernaturally gifted to do the tasks. And the last thing, He says it again in verse 35, has filled them, multiple people, with the skill to do all manner of work. But in verse 34, He has put in his heart the ability to teach. And so here's the gift of teaching. God's called this guy, and now He's gifted him with the skill, and now He's gifted him with the ability and the desire to teach others. I think all these things are just logical. That if you're a born-again Christian and you love the Lord, that you would naturally have a willing heart. You would desire to serve the Lord. You see, when ministry and serving is burdensome, it's not usually because the ministry is a burden. It's because there's a heart issue going on. And we end up pointing fingers at the ministry and being like, well, that's my problem. And it's like, no, actually, that's probably your problem. And when your heart's not right, these things irritate you. They get you in your flesh. But when your heart's in the right place, ministry is a joy and serving is a joy. And also we find that we want to teach others. That there's a natural desire to teach others about what God is doing in us, doing through us, what God has taught us. We want to teach others. And this is why in Hebrews chapter 5, we find a little section of text, I think, that's important, because Hebrews was written to just Hebrews, Jewish believers. It wasn't written to, special people. It wasn't written to church leaders. Hebrews was written to everyday Jewish Christians in this sense, but they were just everyday believers. And so he says to them in verse 12 of Hebrews 5, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers." You need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. And so what he's doing is he's actually rebuking them. He's telling them, why is it that you guys are being such babes and you need to be spoon-fed when by now you should be teaching other people? Something that at least the leadership at our church knows about is a while back we bought a whole box full of these discipleship books. And the whole purpose behind them is for believers to go along with younger believers in the faith, maybe not in age, but at least in the faith, and walk them through it and teach them. And that this isn't something reserved just for special people with a gift of teaching or the gift of this or the call to leadership, but just simply believers teaching believers the Bible. Believers teaching believers what they know and how to go through stuff. And so this is what we find in Exodus 35. We see people whose hearts are stirred, people who are willing to serve, people who are gifted to serve, people who are filled with the Holy Spirit of God, and people with the desire and the skill set to teach. Not the skill set of like being able to teach, but the skill set of like having things to teach. The Bible knowledge that you have, passing it on. The life experiences that you have, passing it on. And I think this is just a model of what the church should look like. People who are authentically excited about Jesus, and therefore they want to serve Jesus, and they want to teach others about Jesus. So there's what we get in Exodus 35 as we wrap up the chapter. It's just some of the things we should be seeing in a healthy Christian life. All right. God bless you guys. I will see you guys another day. Take care.